Welcome to my 198th video on my work with OO gauge. This part will deal with my struggles to convert an Airfix Fowler 4F tender engine, a Duck 6, to run on my Hornby Dublo 3-rail tabletop railway, including various struggles just to get this Airfix 4F model to work properly at all. This is the Duck 6 as I got it. I picked it up pretty much on a whim at the Ancaster train show, as only $35 was being asked, and I thought that it might be a candidate for a 3-rail conversion. These old Airfix Fowler 4Fs are pretty good models. I'm pretty sure that the latest Hornby versions of the 4F are still based on this tooling, although the mechanism has been completely changed and they're charging something like £150 for those now. The Fowler 4F class, popularly known as Duck 6s, were amongst the most common locos on the LMS back in the pre-war period that I model, so they're right at the centre of my prototype. And I did already have an Airfix version and a couple of Hornby examples for running on my other OO gauge layouts. I picked this one up strictly with a view to making it a 3-rail project. Here's the end of the box. Apparently this was purchased for $90, probably quite a long while ago. I believe the model itself dates back to the 1970s. Here it is in its styrofoam block. I would of course have preferred an LMS version. If the conversion project looked likely to succeed at all, I was going to need to change the markings on this model. Here's the bottom of the model. It's tender-driven, with traction tyres on all of the tender wheels and all pickup done from the loco. The tender and the loco are connected by a drawbar which is screwed at both ends, and power is passed from loco to tender via a double wire, which rather awkwardly sticks out the bottom. I tested the model first on my little test track as seen here, and then on my main Hornby layout. The motor seemed to run without problems at this point, though some issues developed later. The immediate problem in these initial tests was that the wheels on the back axle of the tender kept throwing their traction tyres, causing the model to derail. So before anything else could really be done, I was going to need to fix that traction tyre issue. In any case, the model was going to need to come apart, so I got it onto the bench, seen here in the servicing cradle. By the way, this is the Pico cradle. I'm not sure that I'd recommend it. It works okay, but you could probably make something that would work equally well, if not better, just by cutting up a domestic sponge or similar. First, I removed the screw holding the tender end of the drawbar. That screw is also what holds on the tender body. With that screw removed, the tender body can be lifted at the front and then completely taken off. I put the screw back into the tender body just to make keeping track of things easier, as there will be several very similar screws, but they aren't actually interchangeable. I removed the two screws at either end of the loco base plate. This allowed the loco chassis to be removed from the body. It also left the drawbar itself loose. For some reason, the drawbar consists of two identical thin parts. The body has a heavy weight in it, held in by just one screw. I put the body screws back in. The two are different lengths. You can see what I mean here about the drawbar being double. I don't know why they do it like that. I undid the screws holding the large weight onto the tender chassis. These screws also serve to fix the motor mount into the chassis frame. With the weight removed, there is actually nothing holding the motor mount into the chassis frame. This model is powered by Airfix's own version of a Ringfield motor. This uses a rather horribly complex gearbox containing 3 plastic reduction gears to reduce the speed of the motor down for driving the wheels. Later on in my work with this model, a horrible screeching developed, and I had to open up this gearbox, clean it out and reassemble it, which was a real pain to do, especially the reassembly. At this point, my immediate focus was on removing the wheels so that I could take them up to Nigel with British model trains to get replacement traction tyres fitted. I dropped the motor mount with the chassis base and the wheels out of the tender chassis frame. Next, I undid the screws holding on the base plate of the tender chassis. These were quite stiff and required a larger screwdriver. With those screws removed, the ends of the base plate can be popped loose and the base plate can be removed. Once the base plate is removed, the axles and the wheels just drop out. All three axles have gears inside the wheels on one side by which they are driven. The gearbox from the motor drives the large gear seen at left on the chassis, which drives the gears on the front two axles, and then the second large gear at right on the chassis is driven by the centre axle and in turn drives the back axle. I put tags on all three axles and numbered them. They appeared identical, but I find that sometimes if you interchange parts that appear identical, things don't actually work properly anymore. So I prefer to keep them and put them back where they came from. The axle that was throwing its traction tyres was number 3, the back one. I put all three axles into a bag ready to be taken to get replacement traction tyres fitted. Nigel had given me this little pickup with brass feet and phosphor bronze springs, as he knew I was messing around with 3-rail conversions. With a little filing down of the ridges on the sides, I was able to get this pickup fitted to the base plate of the loco. I just drilled holes in the base plate and used the pickup's original screws to fit it. The base plate was plastic, so at this point the pickup wasn't electrically connected to anything. The loco had pickups from the wheels on both sides, and the power from these pickups was passed to the tender by a double wire, the ends of which were soldered to the brush holders on the motor, as seen here. I unsoldered the wire that I believed came from the left pickups, as I thought that this was the one that I should be replacing with pickup from the centre rail. I resoldered the pickup wire that I had desoldered to the other brush holder, so that now power from both sides of the loco would go to one brush, as required for 3-rail operations. I tested continuity between the loco wheels and the brush holder with a multimeter. Next, I wanted to connect my centre rail pickup to the other brush holder. I cut a length of thin black wire and tinned the ends. I soldered one end of that wire to the second brush holder. Then I threaded that wire through and screwed the other end of it down under the centre rail pickup. Actually, my first piece of wire was too short, so I had to do it again, and then I made my second piece of wire longer than it needed to be. I tested continuity again. Now all 6 loco wheels connected to one brush holder and the centre rail pickup connected to the other brush holder. I applied power to the wheels and the centre rail pickup from my bench controller, and the motor turned OK. You can see what I mean here about my second wire connecting the centre rail pickup being too long, but too long is better than too short, and the wire can be adjusted and tucked away somehow. I still hadn't got the traction tyre issue fixed, so I wasn't ready to reassemble the model at this point. But I thought that things were looking reasonably promising, so I decided to go ahead with changing the markings, as I wanted an LMS engine, not a BR one. I got out HMRS press-fix decals for LMS straw markings. I used methyl hydrate on cotton buds to try to remove the BR markings on the tender, as this will generally remove most markings. The gold of the lions was really stubborn and would not come off. I had to use emery paper to complete the removal of the gold lions. I cut around plain LMS letters on the decal set, the last of this type of lettering I had in this set of decals. I peeled off one set of lettering and pressed it into place on the side of the tender. Once pressed into place, the backing paper is wetted with plain water and then removed. Here's one side of the loco and tender after my marking efforts. For the loco numbers, I just removed the initial 4 digits that had been added to make the BR numbers. Here's the other side of the loco and tender. Not the neatest job, I'm afraid, but I think it'll look fairly okay in normal light. Here are the axles back from having traction tyres fitted. We only replaced the tyres on axle 3 as those were the only ones that appeared loose, but I did get a couple of extra tyres just in case. These tyres have become expensive now. These 4 tyres cost me almost as much as I'd paid for the model itself. I put the axles back in place in the tender chassis in the correct order, and then put the base plate back on and screwed it down. I fitted the motor mount and lower chassis back into the chassis frame. The fitting into which the screws through the weight will fit protrudes up through the frame. So when the weight is screwed back in place, the motor mount and the frame are held together. I threaded my new wire from the centre rail pickup through the groove in the weight, together with the original pickup wire. I was left with quite a bit extra, but that could be tucked down over where the suppression capacitor is. I tested with my bench controller again to make sure that applying power to the loco wheels and the centre pickup actually made the tender wheels turn. Here you can see how I've tucked the extra wire down out of the way so that I can refit the tender body. I refitted the tender and loco bodies with the drawbar also held in place by the same screws. I tried the model on a piece of 3-rail track. This allowed me to adjust the centre rail pickups just by bending them to get them to press on the centre rail with enough spring to pick up electricity reliably, but hopefully not so much as to cause the loco to derail. It also confirmed that the model should be able to go round 3-rail curves, as although all of the wheels have flanges, there was a fair bit of play side to side in the axles. I tried the model on my 3-rail tabletop. It did move, but sadly it moved in the wrong direction, backwards when I had the controller set to forward. So I'd got the polarity of the connections wrong. I didn't want to have it working the opposite way to all of my other locos, so back to the bench it went. I removed the tender body again, and removed the weight again. I powered up the soldering station again. I unsoldered the wires from both brush holders, swapped them over, and resoldered them to reverse the polarity. I reassembled the model. The front of the smoke box had fallen off at this point, although I didn't immediately notice that. At this point I tried the model on the tabletop again. Now it ran the correct direction, but it made a horrible screeching noise. I'm afraid I gave up on taking pictures as I fought with that problem. It turned out that the violent screeching was coming from the gearbox on the motor, so I had to take that completely to bits. I removed various hair and debris from inside the gearbox, then lubricated it lightly and reassembled it. It took me several attempts to manage to reassemble the gearbox and get it working properly. There are 3 plastic reduction gears in there, 2 of which run on a separate axle off to one side, and 1 of which runs on an extension of the armature itself. Once I got the model running again without screeching, I tried it on the track again. It did tend to derail on points and curves. I wondered if the wires might be part of the problem. I ended up filing away part of the back of the loco base plate so that the wires didn't need to go down so much. The loco base plate was actually broken with a crack just behind the centre pickup. This seems to be a bit of a chronic problem with these Airfix models. I didn't actually try to fix the crack in the loco base plate, as the back screw seemed to be holding the back piece in place okay. It must be held in place, as that's what keeps the loco axles in place. I put a Pico R2 type simplex coupling on the back of the tender, removing the existing fitting for the tension lock coupling and then drilling a hole for the pin of the R2 coupling. I used CA glue to fix the front of the smoke box on, as it kept falling off. There were no pins to limit the travel of the simplex coupling from side to side, as there should have been, so I put some tack glue onto it to prevent it from swinging around too freely. Here's the model in the servicing cradle after all of my efforts. I got it back onto the tracks for more attempts at running. I'm afraid the results were decidedly mixed. It seemed to pick up pretty well, with just occasional problems on points, and that happens to actual Dublo models too. But there were significant issues with derailing, especially over certain points in a particular direction, so I could get it to run on the tabletop, but not with real flexibility to handle all of the track in all directions. Anyway, I'll finish now with some running video, such as it is.
Well, I'm afraid this business with this 4F has been a massive struggle, and ultimately rather disappointing. I mean, I had all sorts of problems with it, quite apart from the actual 3-rail conversion. It's... oh... whatever. Its traction tires were falling off on the tender, and then the loco base plate broke, and then the front of the smoke box fell off, and then it decided it wanted to emit violent screeching noises from the gearbox in the tender. So I had to fix all of these problems as well as getting it 3-rail converted. And it sort of runs now 3-rail, but the problem is it struggles a lot to get around curves and over points, which is, perhaps not surprising. The old Dublo 3-rail track is not the smoothest thing, especially on points. You've got all these little separate bits on the points, and they tend to end up at different levels, and you've got the little shallow frog part. It's not actually the frog part, I think, that's causing him his problem so much. It's more just that there's irregularities in the rails, and he's a lighter, more modern engine. He's not designed to deal with that kind of thing. The old Dublo engines were heavy, and also they never had flanges on more than 2 sets of wheels, so they were better at dealing with this sort of thing. Anyhow, we'll see what we can do, but I'm not expecting great results, because especially the points at this end, those 2 points seem to be particularly bad. I mean, again, some points are better than others. The point he's coming up to now was a terrible, famous last words, and he got stuck on it because I wasn't going quite fast enough. That was a terrible point. That was a terrible point, but it was so terrible I eventually gave up trying to improve it and took it out and replaced it with another one. See, I don't want him to go too fast, but equally he's got to go fast enough that he can get over the points. Ooh, and he barely got over it that time. He's picking up from the 2 sides of the loco, as he was designed to. Well, no, I mean, not 2 sides now, I beg your pardon. The 2 sides of the loco are picking up from the outer rails, and then I added that little sort of phosphor, bronze and brass pickup in the middle to pick up. If it's one thing and another, I mean, this point he nearly stops. Oh no, he didn't that time. The other points he isn't stopping on, but he was kind of derailing on. And I know he isn't derailing now, but he's very temperamental. He prefers going through them that way. He's much more prone to derail through those points on the right-hand end if I try and take him through them the other way. He's not what you would call a very functional and flexible 3-rail engine. So we've got him to go around a few times now. I mean, he does run 3-rail. That's not so much the problem. The problem is that he can't be reliably expected to cope with curves and points. He has various difficulties. Those points down that end he can go through this way, but if I try and take him through the other way, he can't seem to go through. And for some reason, he has a problem with that curve, and I can't see why. I mean, that curve's been a problem all along, and I changed it once. I took one piece of track out and put a new piece of track in because it was such a problem, but even with a new piece of track, that curve's a bit temperamental, and I don't quite know why. And that's it's the curve, it's not even the point. Oh well, you do what you can. I don't know, we could perhaps try and pull a couple of wagons behind him, but I'm not particularly optimistic. Well, this is a pretty iffy process because, as I say, he's just not a very reliably functioning engine, but I've got a couple of little wagons. The first two are Dublo metal wagons, and the back one is that Trix brake van that I took the lights out of. And we'll see if we can get him to run with a little freight train without collapsing. Whoa. Power-wise, I mean, he's using around about 40% power. I'm running him at with these demonstrations, just over 40% power on this controller. I mean, that's really not the problem. The problem is whether he can stay railed and things. This seems to be his preferred way. I mean, I'm doing it the way he wants best. Running anti-clockwise round the outer section seems to be the best bet. If I run him clockwise round the outer section, he tends to derail on the points at the right-hand end. And running him round the inner section, he tends to derail on that left-hand curve. Which is obviously, you know, not all his fault. It's partially because of track problems, but... Well, he has pulled a little freight train round a few times at least, so he's done something. So I don't know what you'd say, but I mean, I can't honestly say that I feel this attempt to fix up and convert this 4F has been a much of a success. I mean, it's sort of a partial success. Okay, so we got some result. I mean, it's not completely hopeless. I mean, yes, I do have a 4F, and it does sort of, under certain circumstances, if I'm careful with it, run 3-rail. And I only paid $35. Actually, it cost me as much for replacement traction tyres as it cost for the loco. But, because they're getting expensive now. So there you go. We got a Duck 6. It sort of runs 3-rail if you are careful about how you try to run it.